The smell hit you before you reached the fourth floor. Garlic and onions frying in pork fat, the sharp green scent of ricau leaves crushed between someone's fingers, and something sweet bubbling on the back burner that nobody would explain until Christmas. In the tenement kitchens of East 110th and 116th Street, Puerto Rican women cooked full dinners in rooms barely wide enough to turn around in. They did it every day on wages that hardly covered the gas bill. Number 23 on this list kept children awake on school mornings when nothing else would. Number 15 on this list required a stomach strong enough to handle what most Americans threw in the garbage, and the ninth dish here could stretch a single chicken into 3 days of meals for 6 people. These were not exotic recipes from a faraway island. They were the survival engineering of an entire migration, rebuilt one tenement kitchen at a time. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 foods Puerto Rican families ate in 1950s Spanish Harlem. Number 25. Sorolitos de maíz. These golden corn sticks were the first thing children reached for when they walked through the door after school. The recipe was about as simple as cooking gets. Cornmeal, water, salt, a little sugar, and sometimes a handful of cheese melted into the dough while it was still hot. You rolled them between your palms into fat little cigars and dropped them into oil that had already been used twice that week. They came out crisp on the outside and soft enough inside to pull apart with your teeth. In Spanish Harlem, sorolitos were what you made when the rice was gone and the beans were still soaking. They cost almost nothing. A bag of cornmeal from the bodega on Lexington Avenue lasted a family 2 weeks. And for a child growing up in El Barrio, that crunch was the sound of someone making sure you never went to bed hungry. Number 24. Bacalaitos. Salted codfish fritters fried flat and thin, served on a piece of brown paper bag because no one was going to waste a plate on street food. Bacalao had been a staple on the island for centuries, brought over by the Spanish and kept alive because salt cod needed no refrigeration. In the 1950s, Spanish Harlem, the dried fish hung in bodegas on 3rd Avenue like stiff white planks. You soaked it overnight, shredded it by hand, and folded it into a batter of flour, garlic, oregano, and a pinch of baking powder. The fritters hit the oil and spread out into lacy rounds with edges that shattered when you bit through them. Vendors sold them near La Marqueta on Park Avenue for a few cents apiece. They were salty and rich and deeply satisfying, and they reminded every family on the block of something no American restaurant could reproduce. Number 23. Café con leche. Not the watered-down coffee that diners on Madison Avenue served in ceramic mugs. This was Bustelo, brewed dark and thick in a small aluminum greca on the stove, poured into a cup already half full of hot milk, and sweetened until the spoon could almost stand up in it. Puerto Rican mothers gave it to children as young as 5. It was breakfast. It was an after-school pick-me-up. It was the thing a neighbor handed you when you sat down at her kitchen table to talk about anything at all. The greca hissed and sputtered on the burner, and the smell soaked into the walls of every apartment on the floor. Even today, the yellow and red Bustelo can is one of the most recognized brands in East Harlem. The coffee changed. The loyalty never did. Number 22. Malta, India. A dark, sweet, carbonated malt beverage that tasted like liquid bread with molasses stirred in. Mothers in Spanish Harlem gave it to skinny children who would not eat enough. It was not medicine, but it was treated like it. A bottle of Malta after school was supposed to put weight on your bones and iron in your blood, and whether the science held up or not, the belief was absolute. The bottles were brown glass, cold from the bodega refrigerator on a July afternoon when the fire hydrants were already open and the sidewalk was steaming. You drank it straight or poured it over ice with a squeeze of condensed milk. Most mainland Americans had never heard of it, but in El Barrio, a kid turning down a Malta was a kid who was going to hear about it from every adult in the building. Number 21. Tostones. Green plantains, sliced thick, fried once, smashed flat with the bottom of a coffee can, and fried again until the edges turned the color of dark gold. Every Puerto Rican kitchen in Spanish Harlem had a tostinera or some substitute for one. The plantains came from fruit stands on Park Avenue, stacked in bunches so green they looked like they would never ripen. That was the point. You wanted them starchy and firm, the kind that turned almost meaty when they hit the oil a second time. Tostones showed up next to everything. Pernil, beans, stewed chicken, fried pork chops. They were the plate filler, the thing that made a small portion of meat feel like a real dinner. Sprinkle salt while they are still glistening, and the crunch holds for exactly as long as it takes to eat them. Number 20. Sofrito. Every Puerto Rican meal in Spanish Harlem started with this: a thick, wet paste of green peppers, ajíes dulces, garlic, onions, recao, cilantro, and sometimes a ripe tomato, all ground together in a pilon, the heavy wooden mortar that sat on the counter of nearly every kitchen in East Harlem. Without sofrito, nothing tasted right. Rice was just rice, beans were just beans, a pot of chicken was boiled meat and nothing more. But a spoonful of sofrito dropped into hot oil at the start of cooking changed everything. The kitchen filled with a smell so specific that people who grew up with it can identify it 30 years later in a single breath. The sound of that first sizzle, when the paste hit the manteca in the caldero, was the announcement that dinner was being taken seriously. In the 1950s, the ingredients came from La Marqueta, the massive open-air market that stretched under the railroad tracks on Park Avenue between 111th and 116th Streets. Vendors there sold recao in bunches, ajíes dulces by the handful, and garlic by the braid. These were ingredients that no American supermarket stocked. They did not appear in any cookbook published in English. They were invisible to the food world that surrounded Spanish Harlem on every side, and that invisibility was part of the point. Sofrito was a secret kept in plain sight. Every family had its own version, and every version was the correct one. Grandmothers made it in large batches on Saturday mornings and stored it in glass jars in the refrigerator, enough to last the week. The pilon grew heavier and more stained with each passing year, and nobody replaced it until it cracked. You did not learn sofrito from a book. You learned it by standing next to someone who never measured a thing, and you remembered it by smell for the rest of your life. Number 19. Pan sobao, a soft, slightly sweet white bread with a crust so thin it practically dissolved, and an inside pillowy enough that pressing it left fingerprints. On the island, pan sobao came from the neighborhood panaderia. In Spanish Harlem, it came from bakeries on Lexington Avenue that kept the tradition alive by feel rather than formula. The dough used lard, which gave it a richness American sandwich bread never had. You ate it plain, pulled apart in strips and dipped into café con leche. You used it to soak up the last of the bean broth at the bottom of your plate. And when the bread got stale after a day or two, you toasted it on the stovetop burner and spread mantequilla across it until the butter melted through. Nothing went to waste. The bread was too good, and the budget was too tight. Number 18. Guineos verdes en escabeche. Boiled green bananas, sliced into thick rounds and dressed in a vinegar and olive oil mixture with sliced onions, pimiento stuffed olives, and whole black peppercorns. This was party food, funeral food, and Wednesday night food, depending on what else was available. The bananas were cheap, they kept well, and when they sat in that escabeche overnight, they absorbed the tang of the vinegar until every bite carried a sharp, briny kick. You could make a full tray for less than $1. The texture was firm and waxy, denser than a potato salad, and the olives gave it small bursts of salt that kept your hand going back. It was one of those dishes that tasted better the second day, which made it perfect for a family that planned every meal around stretching things as far as they could go. Number 17. Viandas. The word covered an entire family of starchy root vegetables: yautía, malanga, yuca, ñame, batata. They were boiled together in a big pot and served alongside whatever protein the family could afford, or they were the protein. In 1950s Spanish Harlem, viandas were cheap, filling, and familiar. The families who settled in East Harlem brought the taste for these roots straight from the island, and the vendors at La Marqueta kept the supply steady. You peeled them with a knife, not a vegetable peeler, because most had bark-like skin that no peeler could handle. They went into boiling water, dense and raw, and came out soft enough to break with a fork. A drizzle of olive oil, some sliced onion, a splash of vinegar. That was the whole preparation. The simplicity was the point. There is a pattern in the food of every migration, and it looks the same whether the family came from Bayamon or Calabria or Canton. You bring what you know, you find the nearest version of the ingredients you left behind, and you rebuild in a kitchen that smells wrong and a building that sounds wrong, the one thing that still tastes like the place you came from. In 1950s Spanish Harlem, that rebuilding happened in hundreds of kitchens at the same time, and nobody outside the neighborhood paid any attention. Number 16. Empanadillas. Half-moon turnovers filled with seasoned ground beef, sometimes crab, and occasionally just cheese, sealed by pressing the edges with the tines of a fork and fried until the shell blistered amber. The dough was made from flour and lard, rolled thin and cut into circles using the rim of a coffee can. In El Barrio, empanadillas showed up at every gathering. Birthday parties, domino nights, after-church lunches on Sunday. They traveled well, tasted good cold, and could be made in batches of 50 without much more effort than making 10. The fillings depended on what was affordable that week. Picadillo with olives and capers was the classic, but during a lean stretch, a handful of queso blanco and a strip of roasted pepper did fine. You ate them standing up, napkin in one hand, empanadilla in the other, talking about something that had nothing to do with food. Number 15. Mondongo, tripe stew. The dish that separated the people who grew up eating it from the people who could not get past what it was made of. Honeycomb tripe, scrubbed clean and boiled for hours with chunks of calabaza, potatoes, yuca, green plantain, and a sofrito base that turned the broth a deep orange. In the 1950s, tripe was among the cheapest cuts in any butcher shop in New York because most American customers refused to touch it. Puerto Rican families knew exactly what to do with it. They always had. The cooking took patience. You boiled the tripe until it went from rubbery to tender, and that could mean 3 hours on a low flame. The kitchen smelled heavy and rich, and the finished stew had a thickness that sat in your stomach like a blanket. Mondongo was Saturday food in most households. It fed a crowd, it lasted 2 days, and it turned a cut of meat that cost almost nothing into a meal that felt like abundance. Number 14. Pastels. If any single dish defined the labor of Puerto Rican cooking in Spanish Harlem, it was this one. Pastels were not something you made alone. They were a production. The masa came from green bananas and green plantains, peeled and grated by hand on a box grater until your knuckles were raw. Some families added yautía or calabaza to the mixture for body. The filling was pork shoulder, braised slow with sofrito, olives, capers, raisins, and roasted red peppers. And then came the wrapping. You laid out a square of parchment paper, smeared it with achiote-colored oil, spread a layer of mesa across it, spooned the filling down the center, folded the paper into a tight rectangular packet, and tied it shut with kitchen string, one at a time, 40, 60, sometimes 100 pastels in a single session. The whole family gathered around the table for this. Grandmothers, mothers, aunts, older children with stained fingers and sore arms. The kitchen table vanished under sheets of paper and bowls of masa and the smell of achiote oil, which stained everything it touched a vivid orange red that did not wash out for days. In El Barrio, pastels meant Christmas. Preparation started days before Noche Buena, and the finished packets were boiled in batches and stored for the holiday table. But they also appeared at baptisms, weddings, and any occasion important enough to justify the hours of work. A neighbor showing up at your door with a dozen pastels wrapped in foil was saying something that did not need words. The tradition of making them together, the pastelada, mattered as much as the food itself. It was the one afternoon when the kitchen belonged to everyone, and the stories that came out during the wrapping stayed longer than the pastels ever did. When families eventually left El Barrio for the Bronx or New Jersey, the pastelada was the last tradition they gave up. Many of them never did. Number 13. Tembleque. A coconut milk pudding so delicate it trembled when you carried the plate to the table, which is exactly where the name came from. coconut milk, sugar, cornstarch, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a drop of vanilla. You stirred it constantly on the stove so the bottom would not scorch, poured it into a mold, and let it set in the refrigerator until it held its shape but still wobbled at the slightest touch. A dusting of cinnamon on top. Nothing more. Tembleque belonged to the Nochebuena table alongside pasteles and pernil, but it also appeared in the middle of July for no particular reason, because it was cool and light and sweet, and it cost almost nothing to make. Children loved it. Adults ate it standing at the counter before dinner and pretended they had not. Number 12. Morcilla, blood sausage, dark and dense, with rice and cilantro and spices packed inside a natural casing. The taste was earthy, almost mineral, and the texture ranged from crumbly to smooth, depending on who made it and how long it sat on the heat. In Spanish Harlem, morcilla came from a small number of carnicherias that served the Puerto Rican community. You could not find it in a regular grocery store. It was sliced and pan-fried until the casing crisped and the inside heated through, eaten with rice and beans, or by itself as a snack while the main meal cooked. The smell of frying morcilla was strong enough that neighbors knew what was for dinner through the walls. You either grew up with it and loved it, or you encountered it as an adult and did not know what to make of it. There was very little middle ground. Number 11. Plátanos maduros, ripe plantains, so ripe the skin had gone almost black, sliced on a diagonal and fried until the edges caramelized and the flesh turned soft and sweet enough to pass for dessert. The difference between tostones and maduros was patience. You waited. You let the plantain sit on the counter until it was covered in dark spots and gave when you pressed it. Then you fried it, and the natural sugars did everything else. Maduros went alongside beans and rice, alongside pork chops, alongside anything that needed a sweet counterpoint. Children ate them with their fingers straight off the plate, and nobody stopped them. They were comfort at its most direct, the kind of side dish that made a plain meal feel generous, and nobody who grew up eating them in El Barrio ever forgot that taste. Number 10. Mofongo. Green plantains, fried in chunks until they were cooked through but not yet crisp, then dropped into a wooden pylon with garlic, a little olive oil, and pieces of crackling chicharron, and pounded until everything came together into a dense, fragrant mound. The pestle did what no blender ever could, bruising the plantain just enough to hold its shape while it soaked up the garlic and the pork fat. In El Barrio kitchens, the pilon was not optional. A family might own one good pot and 2 chipped plates, but there was always a pylon, usually passed down, the inside worn smooth from years of mashing. The mound was shaped in the center of the plate and served with a cup of garlicky chicken broth alongside, so the dry plantain could be loosened bite by bite. It stretched a small amount of meat across a whole table. For a Puerto Rican family that had traded the plantain fields of the island for a 4th-floor walk-up, a plate of mofongo on a Sunday was home itself, rebuilt with whatever the bodega had that week. Number 9. Asopao de pollo. In every tenement kitchen on 110th Street, there was a caldero that had made this dish so many times the inside carried a permanent golden stain from achiote. Asopao was not soup, and it was not stew. It sat somewhere in between, thick enough that a wooden spoon could almost stand upright in the center of the bowl. The base started with sofrito, slow cooked until the peppers and garlic melted into the oil. Then tomato sauce, green olives, capers, and strips of roasted pimiento went in before the chicken. The rice was the engine. 2 cups of grain dropped into that broth, swelled and broke apart over the next 40 minutes, absorbing liquid until the whole pot turned creamy and dense, stretching one chicken into 6 heavy bowls. That expansion was the mathematics every Puerto Rican mother in El Barrio understood without writing it down. 1 bird, 2 cups of rice, enough water to fill the pot, and you had dinner tonight, plus 2 reheated rounds that only got thicker with each pass over the flame. The chicken simmered until the meat separated from the bone at the slightest touch, and the broth turned a deep saffron gold from the achiote and picked up a briny, savory undertone from the olive liquid. In a building where the radiators clanked all winter but barely pushed heat past the first room, a bowl of asopao held more warmth than anything the landlord provided. It was also the dish that traveled. When someone on the third floor lost a job, or a woman on the fifth floor had just come home with a new baby, or a neighbor had been coughing for a week and could not shake it, a pot of asopao went down the hallway without anyone needing to ask. The sight of a woman carrying that caldero with both hands through a narrow corridor was its own language in Spanish Harlem. Everyone on the floor already knew what it meant. Every family from Ponce to Bayamon to Aguadilla made asopao a little differently on the island, but in the cold water flats of El Barrio, those differences dissolved. The recipe became one thing, the meal you made when someone needed to feel held together. The kitchens of Spanish Harlem produced something no city agency or social program could replicate. They produced belonging. A woman who had arrived in New York 3 months ago and a woman who had been there 10 years could sit at the same table over the same pot and understand each other completely without discussing what they had left behind. The stove was the one place in the apartment where the rules of the old country still held, and nobody argued with them there. Number 8. Carne guisada, beef stew Puerto Rican style, which meant the meat was braised rather than roasted, simmered in a tomato-based sauce with potatoes, carrots, olives, and sofrito. The cuts were cheap, chuck or stewing beef, bought from the butcher who knew which families needed the tougher pieces because they had the patience to cook them right. The pot sat on a low flame for hours while the apartment went about its business. By the time the meat was soft enough to break with a spoon, the sauce had thickened into something nearly like gravy, and the potatoes had dissolved at the edges into the liquid. Carne guisada went over white rice, and the rice soaked up the sauce until every grain was stained red. Nobody rushed a guisado. The stove did the work. Time did the rest. Number 7, sancocho, a massive one-pot stew built from every root vegetable and every cut of meat a family could gather. Yuca, utia, ñame, green plantain, corn on the cob sliced into thick rounds, and a mix of chicken, pork, and sometimes beef, all simmered until the broth went cloudy and starchy from the roots dissolving at the edges. Sancocho was weekend cooking. You needed a big pot, a full afternoon, and enough mouths to justify the volume, because a proper sancocho served 10 or 12. It appeared when extended family came from the Bronx or from other tenements in the neighborhood. Everybody got a bowl, everybody got a piece of corn. And the broth was the part that mattered most, because it tasted like the whole island had been boiled down into something you could hold in your hands on a cold New York afternoon. Number 6. Habichuelas guisadas, stewed beans served over white rice. The single most eaten combination in Puerto Rican cooking and the backbone of nearly every dinner table in 1950s Spanish Harlem. Pink beans or red kidney beans, soaked overnight and cooked the next day with sofrito, tomato sauce, a piece of ham bone or a chunk of salt pork, potatoes cut into rough chunks, and calabaza that melted into the broth and thickened it. The beans always went over a mound of white rice, and the proper way to eat them was to let the sauce spread until every forkful carried both. This was what families came back to when money was short, and in the tenements of East Harlem that was most weeks. Beans and rice together formed a complete protein, though nobody on 110th Street used that language. They just knew it worked. Their mothers had known, their grandmothers before them. Number 5. Alcapurrias, torpedo-shaped fritters made from a dough of grated green banana and yautía, stuffed with seasoned ground beef and deep-fried until the outside formed a thick, dark crust. Making alcapurrias tested your skill. The masa had to be fine enough to hold together, but not so fine it turned gummy. You shaped each one by pressing a ball of dough flat in your palm, placing a spoonful of picadillo in the center, and folding the dough around it until the seam disappeared. Then into the oil. The smell was unmistakable, heavy and starchy and rich, drifting through hallways and out to the street. At Cuchifritos stands in El Barrio, a couple of dollars bought 3 or 4 of them wrapped in wax paper. They were street food and home food and party food, and the women who made them best never wrote the recipe down. Number 4. Pernil, roast pork shoulder, marinated for at least a day in a paste of garlic, oregano, vinegar, salt, pepper, olive oil, and the juice of sour oranges. The marinade was stabbed deep into the meat through cuts made with a sharp knife so the flavor reached all the way to the bone. Then the shoulder went into the oven, covered in foil, and roasted for 5 or 6 hours until the fat rendered completely and the skin turned into a sheet of crackling called cuero that shattered when you tapped it with a fork. In El Barrio, pernil was Christmas. The oven ran all day on December 24th in apartments where the oven doubled as the only reliable heat source in winter. The smell of roasting pork filled the entire building, floor by floor. By evening, the hallways smelled like garlic and rendered fat, and every door on the floor was open because someone was sharing. Number 3. Coquito. Puerto Rican eggnog made with coconut milk, condensed milk, evaporated milk, vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, and white rum. Mixed together, chilled in glass bottles, and passed around the living room at every Christmas gathering while someone played aguinaldos on a guitar and the children stayed up past midnight. The recipe was a family secret, which meant every household had one, and every household believed theirs was the best. The rum content varied. Some versions were polite, others were not. You could taste the difference by the second glass, and by the third, the argument about whose coquito was superior had become part of the evening. The bottles were washed and stored year to year, and when they came out the following December, the kitchen smelled like nutmeg and anticipation. Coquito was never sold in stores. It was made at home and shared only with the people who mattered. Number 2. Flan de queso. Cream cheese flan, baked in a round pan lined with caramelized sugar, then flipped upside down so the caramel ran down the sides in a glossy amber sauce. The custard was dense and silky, made with cream cheese, eggs, condensed milk, evaporated milk, and vanilla, blended smooth and poured over the hot caramel. It baked in a water bath, which kept the custard from cracking and cooled for hours before anyone was allowed to touch it. Flan signaled an occasion: birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners with guests. The moment of flipping the pan was always tense. A clean release meant a smooth surface with caramel pooling around it in a perfect ring. A rough release meant you scraped and rearranged and served it anyway, because the taste did not change. Number 1. Arroz con gandules, rice with pigeon peas, cooked in a caldero with sofrito, tomato sauce, a piece of salt pork, and a handful of green olives. This was the dish, the one that appeared at every holiday, every gathering, every Sunday dinner, and most weeknights when nothing else was planned. The pigeon peas came from a can in the 1950s, though some families still used dried ones soaked overnight. The rice was medium grain, cooked until each kernel stood separate and carried the flavor of the pork and the sofrito through every bite. And the bottom of the caldero produced the pegao, that crust of toasted rice that cracked when you lifted it with a spoon. That was the prize. Arroz con gandules was not the most elaborate dish on this list. It was not the most expensive or the most difficult, but it was the one every Puerto Rican family in Spanish Harlem agreed on without discussion. It was the taste of the island rebuilt in a city that did not know it existed. And if this was Sunday dinner in a 5th-floor apartment on East 116th Street, with the L train rattling the windows and the smell of sofrito settling into the walls, you carry that taste with you no matter where you go. It is not nostalgia. It is identity. The kitchens of 1950s. Spanish Harlem are mostly gone now. The buildings have changed. The rents have changed. La Marqueta is not what it once was. But the food survived, because the women who brought it from Ponce and Bayamon and Arecibo did not write it down in books. They wrote it into their children. If you grew up with any of these dishes on your table, leave a comment and tell us which one stays with you. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time.